The 400-hectare park is perched on a peninsula at the edge of downtown. It's often recognized as one of the greatest urban parks in the world and is full of walkers enjoying the salty ocean air and cyclists cruising the seawall. Centuries-old cedar and giant Douglas fir trees tower over the land and the people below. And it's under the cloaked canopy of these trees, in the shadows, where skeletons are hidden. Stanley Park has a dark side. Nearly 70 years ago, a chilling discovery was made.
There was a gardener named Albert Tong, City of Vancouver gardener, working in Stanley Park, cleaning up a brush area. It was just near the old fish hatchery in a bush area.
On January 14th, 1953, the groundskeeper was doing kind of, not even yearly maintenance, just kind of maintenance that came around to that area. He heard the crack and looked down and realized what he was stepping on. And he actually stepped on one of the skulls. Investigators from the homicide unit at the time, they found 2 skulls with all of the skeletal remains.
The skeletons belong to 2 children. Detectives still have the original handwritten police report. The first child apparently had been lying face down, it says, as the zipper of what appears to be a sweater was beneath the body.
From the reports in the file, one was laying down and the other one was laying across the legs of the other. They basically looked at the scene, recovered in a small blue lunch pail that had some children's coloring inside it that they'd obviously done with crayons, and it was all mushy because it had been out in the elements so long. And they also recovered a broken hatchet.
This was the kind of weapon used in the murder. It's called a lather's hammer. It was found with the bodies and the shaft was broken just about here.
There was significant trauma to each side of the head, so there would have been a tremendous blood loss immediately from a head wound that size. When they recovered the bones, that they discovered that it looked like somebody had attempted to dig a grave, but trying to dig a grave in a forested area is extremely difficult because of the root systems of the trees and etc.
At the time, the story dominated newspaper headlines, but there were no reports of missing children that helped police identify the young victims.
When the pathologist examined the remains, they believed that it was a young boy and a young girl.
Detectives estimated the children had been dead for at least 3 years and maybe more. The police report said the bodies were covered by 3 layers of hemlock needles spaced by 2 deciduous leaf layers.
This first photo shows the position of the 2 skulls and the children's shoes. The shoe of a woman was found beneath the remains of the girl.
They located a shoe, a female shoe. I think it was about a size 5, and they could tell that it had a bit of red on it.
The clothing was similar on both children, sort of a plaid jacket and a leather aviator's helmet that you could buy at Hudson's Bay back in those days. I think it was $1.38 each, and corduroy type pants.
Their pants held with an elastic and a safety pin. Maybe hand-me-downs, or maybe the mom bought clothes big enough so they could wear them for a long time because they didn't have money to spend.
On top of the remains, there was a lady's very cheap fur coat thrown over that had largely disintegrated.
It being a woman's coat led me to believe that it could very well have been their mother who could have been responsible for this. And I think even that notion is almost terrifying in itself.
Using the skulls, an anthropologist created molded busts of what they believed the boy and girl looked like.
They got a tip early on that there was a woman seen with a little bit wild hair, I think is how it was described on the seawall. She comes out missing a shoe and might have had a limp, but that might have been because she was missing a shoe. So they're trying to chase down who that woman could have been.
There was lots of tips about who that woman might be that were followed up extensively by the detectives that worked on this case throughout the years.
But at the time, the leads were dead ends. The children's identities remained a secret, known only to those involved in the murder. And the killer, or killers, remained at large.
You had these remains of two children who had been horrifically murdered, their lives stolen from them. It brought fear across the community for several summers. The fear of, there was some sort of child killer on the loose.
Coming up, a new detective takes on the case in hopes of solving the decades-old murders. Will DNA provide the answers? Welcome back. In an attempt to help solve the mystery behind the discovered remains, police call on Crime Stoppers. We now return to Jules Knox with The Babes in the Woods.
3 decades pass after the children's skulls are found in Stanley Park. Police receive various tips over the years, but the leads go nowhere. The chilling double murder still haunts the city of Vancouver.
Time passes, stories start getting told, and the speculation, rumors continue. It starts becoming folklore of the city. A case of 2 children found in one of the most beautiful city parks in the world.
The cars! Now,
Crime Stoppers filmed a recreation, speculating about some of the details of that fateful day, and hoping it would spark new leads.
We've been considering for a long time doing a Crime Stoppers show on an old homicide, just to see if we can get results. And we selected The Babes in the Wood because it's Vancouver's most infamous murder and because there's an awful lot of interest in this crime in Vancouver.
It was like stepping back in time this morning in Stanley Park. The costumes and cars recreate that October day 33 years ago. While camera crews prepare their shots, Crime Stopper director Grant Fredericks briefs the actors.
And you'll be facing this way, over here, and back up a step. Okay. When I say go, I want you to, there's going to be cars coming down here, so you want to keep your kids off the side.
The actors are non-professionals, relatives of policemen. Then it's time to slate and roll the camera to recreate one of Vancouver's most sensational unsolved murders. It was on October the 5th, 1947, when the 2 children, the boy 6, the girl 8, were taken into the park by a woman believed to be their mother. The children thought they were going on a picnic. Today, the cameras painstakingly followed the route of the doomed children. One witness saw the trio and later said the woman left the park alone and coatless. At a secluded spot just off Pipeline Road, as they opened their lunchbox, the 2 were bludgeoned to death by the woman. The chief investigator was this man, Don McKay. He was a sergeant then. He worked on the case for 3 years on his own time.
What prompted you to put in so much time in this case?
Well, I guess my wife would agree that it was kind of an obsession. Go to bed at night with a pad and paper, and wake up in the night and make notes. It got to me. I had 2 children, about the same ages.
People who grew up in those times of how parents were terrified of letting their children out on the streets when they heard about this, and they grew up thinking there was a boogeyman out there hurting children.
McKay found the witness who had seen the trio. He believes he knows who did it.
We did find enough evidence to be fairly sure, but not enough to convict.
Well, Don, he did an awful lot of work. But Don went to his grave thinking that it was a woman in a mental institute in Quebec that had done this. And 2 detectives from the VPD went back to Quebec and found out, no, the children were still alive there. So it wasn't a lack of effort on behalf of the Vancouver Police Department and other agencies that would help as well. But it's just that there were a lot of blind leads.
Now retired Sergeant Brian Honeyborn picked up the Babes in the Woods file in the late 90s.
It was quite thick. There were actually 2 binders. Some of the pages looks like mice or rats had chewed at the paper. It was in pretty deplorable condition. And a lot of the reports were handwritten, and it was hard to read. The crux of the whole thing, we wanted to know who they are. When I was a detective sergeant, I found that the remains were on display in the Vancouver Police Museum. Well, I'm a father, and I wouldn't want my children's remains on display, and I don't think most people would. I just didn't think it was the right thing to do. So I went down to the museum one day, and on my own, I seized all the remains and the exhibits. And then I arranged to take the remains on the Vancouver police boat with a chaplain, and we went off Kitsilano Point, where just by chance the Children's Festival was on. It was very somber. The crew members showed respect. We had a prayer. The police chaplain dedicated the remains to the ocean, and I felt good putting their remains into the sea where they would be free. I've had the odd person say to me why I didn't take the remains back to Stanley Park, and my reply to that was, why would I do that? That's where they were murdered.
Although most of the children's remains were set to sea, the detective kept a crucial amount of DNA, the 2 skulls.
I kept some biological samples, which we kept secret for years, because we didn't think the public had to know what samples of the victims we kept.
So he took the remains and he started his investigation, which included vital stats, school board records. He was relentless in just looking through every little thing that was available for him.
Anything that shows any promise at all, you've got to follow up. That's police work.
Coming up, the detective's work pays off. New technology results in a shocking discovery that prompts police to question previously discarded tips. By the late 90s, it had been more than 40 years since the skeletons of 2 children were found partially buried in Vancouver's Stanley Park. Detectives now turn to an emerging science to see if it can provide any new leads. We now return to the Babes in the Woods.
Still searching for a break in the double child murder, police hoped new science could help crack the cold case.
I took the remains out to my friend Dr. David Sweet at the Bureau of Legal Dentistry at UBC, and David and we extracted teeth from the skulls. Now, because of David's advancement in technology and as a scientist, he was able to extract DNA from the teeth remains of the victims.
In the late 90s, Dr. Dean Hildebrand worked with Dr. David Sweet on the file.
I got involved with this case because I was hired as a research associate working in a brand new forensic laboratory at UBC. And that laboratory was tasked with tackling historical homicide cases. And the Vancouver Police Department saw an opportunity to reignite the investigation and try some newer technology back in the day on these remains. The circumstances and the history of this case, it was special in a sense. And so we knew very early that it was going to be a high impact and important case to work on. We had developed a bunch of protocols for teeth and bones, and we applied it on a number of cases, obviously, and this was one of the very first ones we ever used it on. An analysis for us involves, for bones and teeth, you have to get the DNA out of these difficult, hard tissues. And particularly old samples like this, you got to be careful with contamination.
So we're going to be doing a tooth grinding today.
At the British Columbia Institute of Technology, researchers showed us the technique using sample teeth.
And we have one of our teeth here, and we're just going to pop it in. It has a magnetic bar in the tube, because in the cryogenic grinder here, on either side is a stronger magnet, and it'll basically flip back and forth in order to move the bar and pulverize the tooth. So I'm just going to fill this up with liquid nitrogen. So we do like to let it pre-cool a bit. So I'm going to pop that in there. We usually run one cycle of 1 minute. So basically we end up with a powder, like that. So we want to basically give as much surface area to a bone or a tooth that we can for the DNA extraction process.
So we take that extract and we use other tests to determine if there's human DNA in it, and if there's enough human DNA in it to actually amplify or Xerox regions of interest to produce the DNA profile.
So the thermal cycler, that allows us to increase the amount of DNA. So it's a chemical process, so we put the DNA, the extracted DNA, in a tube along with a primer and something called Taq polymerase. And we'd place them in. So basically it has a series of steps where it ramps up the temperature and then goes back down, ramps back up. Basically goes through a cycle of extending and creating more DNA copies.
And what does the product look like when you bring it out?
Exactly the same.
And so you go from one copy of the DNA to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. So it's a chain reaction, every time doubling.
You know, when you were doing this back in the day, what was the quality of the sample that you were able to work with?
In this case, we had workable samples. They were old, but not necessarily mistreated. They were stored in a museum, so it would have been relatively cool, relatively dry. It's not like they were buried in the ground for all those decades. In this case, we were able to get DNA profiles from both sets of remains.
I was in Kelowna on another case when David phoned me, and he said, "Brian, are you sitting down?" And I said, "Why?"
Initial results were confirmed with additional testing, and it was determined that they were not a boy and a girl. In fact, they were two boys that were related as half-brothers. They shared a mother but not a father.
The initial forensic analysis that suggested the victims were probably a girl and boy had been wrong.
Well, it was very shocking for me because the police would have disregarded any information on two boys. They thought they were looking for a boy and girl.
Detective Mackay spent years looking for the wrong thing. All of a sudden, now they've rerouted and now they're looking for the right thing. But at that point, now you're dealing with individuals whose memories are definitely faded, people who may have had information no longer being around, whether they've moved or passed away. Detective Mackay not having the right information was pivotal.
As researchers worked on identifying the children, investigators worked on identifying their killer by revisiting old tips.
One of the tips we got that I think has the most credence is this man remembers the day that he saw this woman and this man with two young boys who was walking through the paths at the time at Stanley Park. He was collecting samples of water from that area, and he recalls it because it was something that he generally never did, and he recalled it because it seemed odd to him. He came upon the same woman that he had seen before, talking to a gentleman. She was no longer wearing the fur coat, and she was a bit disheveled and crying, and a man standing over her who he in his tip said he felt like he just wanted him to go away. So he did.
Coming up, detectives slowly unravel the mystery behind what happened to the two boys. But will it bring them closer to the person who killed them? Welcome back. Despite the discovery that the victims were two boys and not a boy and a girl, the trail goes cold again. That's until detectives turn to forensic genealogy to open new doors. We now return to Jules Knox with The Babes in the Woods.
For decades, the Babes in the Woods file was passed down between generations of detectives as older investigators retired and younger officers tried to crack the cold case.
It's one of those cases that has been talked about in the lores of the VPD for generations, quite frankly. It's a true blue mystery. I was a sergeant in homicide, and I picked up the case. One tip, for example, was the idea that the mom, it was a mom that killed the boys, and maybe she had mental problems. And so, for example, to access records for Riverview, that was the psychiatric facility back then. The museum that's in Victoria, they have the records. Who knew? And so what I did is I went through everybody in that time period, every woman that had children, and see if any of those children are or were unaccounted for later on. That's just one thing I did, and that didn't prove to be fruitful.
There was one particular tip before the groundskeepers had found these boys. There was another groundskeeper, and they had a daughter, and the belief was that she was sent away because she was pregnant overseas, had one child, had another child, and then returned. And due to her mental state, she killed these children, and then she kind of was vanished back overseas. My inspector, which is kind of nice that he was involved in the file, he went so far as exhuming a body of someone because they got a tip and believed that this young man who had died might have been these boys' brothers.
I tracked down his relatives, and they were in Montana, or they still are there in Montana, and was able to get permission from that family to exhume his body to do a DNA comparison.
They weren't able to compare the DNA from the exhumed body with the DNA from the boys because of the degradation.
The result was inconclusive. In May of 2020, 67 years after the boys' skeletons were discovered in Stanley Park, Detective Aida Rodriguez was assigned the Babes in the Woods file with her partner, Tim Russell.
I read through it, and we're supposed to not get emotional, but for me it really touched a nerve. The idea that two young children were just kind of left out in the cold for 5 years. When we found them, they had already spent so many years without an identity. For me, it was super important at that point that I make every effort that I could to give these 2 boys their names.
When it came to us in 2020, there was no suspect, there was no lead, there was nothing concrete that we could look at. A well-known DNA expert directed us to Dr. Anthony Redgrave. Upon Googling and searching him and doing our research, it became extremely apparent that they were highly successful in the United States, assisting law enforcement in identifying unknown remains. And then from that moment forward, the case really just kind of took off.
Dr. Redgrave, he suggested a lab back east here in Canada, which is Lakehead University is where we went. We got very lucky in where they extracted a usable sample on the older of the 2 boys. They were able to sequence it, and Dr. Redgrave was super excited and uploaded it to GEDmatch and started his work.
Well, GEDmatch is much like the Ancestry.com and 23andMe. They're publicly available databases where you could submit your genome and start to look for long-lost relatives.
But you can also look for long-lost criminals too.
Exactly. It's just how you use the technique.
So Dr. Redgrave called me. He goes, I don't want to get too excited, but I think I've identified grandparents for these boys. So the grandparents had 3 sons and 3 daughters. And one of the things that we were able to determine is that the boys shared a mom. And so we were able to immediately eliminate the 3 sons that these 2 individuals had and start focusing on the 3 women. One of the moms, Dr. Redgrave, he was able to identify all of their children, and they were all either had passed away naturally or had lived a very, very long time. The issue that we ran into is that there were 3 women, but 2 of them were twins. If they were identical, it would be very difficult to determine which one would be the mom. One of them had 1 child that Dr. Redgrave could find, and another one had 3, whom he was able to kind of eliminate.
Dr. Anthony Redgrave believes the boy's mother is a woman named Eileen Bousquet. She passed away in 1996 at the age of 78.
Eileen Benediction Bousquet was her name. She had 1 daughter that they knew of. In her obituary, it stated that Eileen had passed away and had been survived by her daughter.
Eileen's daughter was Diane. She died in 2020. And in Diane's obituary, posted in the local newspaper, it said she was the eldest of 3 children, not an only child.
Dr. Redgrave and I got very excited because we're like, there's nothing. I went through every data bank that I had. He went through his data banks, and there was nothing showing that Eileen had 3 children or that her daughter had any siblings. I was not prepared to hear the story that I heard. I didn't think that these boys would have a sibling. So I was able to track down Eileen's granddaughter.
75 years after the double murder in Stanley Park, police called a woman they believe is the boy's niece.
And I said, the reason I'm calling is that we think you might be related to 2 victims of a homicide, historical. And the very first thing out of her mouth was, are they my mother's brothers? And I stayed very quiet because I was like, oh my God, I think they may be, because I didn't even know that anyone knew these boys existed.
It was a tricky day because we wanted to confirm via DNA that we were correct in our beliefs, and so we needed cooperation from the family, but knowing, the elephant in the room, that their relative, who they knew, who had been in their lives, was potentially a homicide suspect. At the same time, transition to the fact that we are essentially conducting a next of kin notification to let them know that these boys were their relatives, and that they had been murdered.
So we headed out there to chat with her. The moment I sit down, I said, "Thank you for having us in your home." And the words out of her mouth, which I'll never forget because I almost cried, was, "Is this about Derek and David?" And I was stunned because it was the first time that I heard these boys' names.
Coming up, with the boys finally being identified, will their family reveal the mystery behind their untimely deaths? After discovering the young murder victims' identities, detectives pieced together the boys' past. We return now to Jules Knox with the conclusion of The Babes in the Woods.
The family brought out some photos of the boys. They were beach day photos. Yeah, it was a bit surreal. You read and look at, investigative photos, and you look at photos of remains, and then all of a sudden you're now being shown a face. It was a moment I probably will never forget.
She told me that it was Derek and David Dalton. They were her mother's brothers, so her uncles, and that she knew they existed, just didn't know where. Derek was a little blonde, happy. He probably was very rambunctious. There's one photo of David being held upside down, just your typical happy little boys. And it made me happy that they did have some very happy memories. The three children, Derek, David, and their sister, all had different parents. So Mom made up the last name Dalton. She was never married to anyone named Dalton.
Eileen's granddaughter shared photos of the boys with police and the public, but declined an interview for this story.
She was very free with letting us know that in her family, she grew up with her grandmother, Eileen, whom she loved very much and was very kind and loving to her. And she said that they knew that her mother had had two brothers that had been removed from the home by the ministry. Every time she asked her grandmother about it, her grandmother would cry and refuse to have the conversation. And she said she tried multiple times more because she said her mom, I think, wanted to find the boys, because her mom at the time that the boys disappeared was 10 years old.
Despite what the family had been told, police do not believe that the boys were taken away by the ministry.
Do you have any sense of how it impacted the sister, growing up with two brothers and then just not having them there anymore?
I feel she must have always carried it with her, given that her daughter knew that she wanted to find her brothers. She must have always wondered. I can't imagine what it must be like to know that you have siblings out there and have zero idea where they went. She was lucky to stay with Mom, and her brothers didn't have the same fortune. When she got older, her daughter said, "Let's do a DNA thing and see if we can find them," because she truly believed that they were alive. So as we're sitting there talking, she agreed to upload her mom's DNA to GEDmatch so that Dr. Redgrave could see if it was a match. I was pretty confident it was them. It had to be 100%.
We went down to the Vancouver School Board and started working with one of their archivists to pull school records from the 1940s.
The reason why we think that these children were likely murdered the first 2 weeks of September of 1947 is because the records show that on September 19th, the three children, Derek, David, and their sister, were transferred from their school. They were at Hudson Elementary to an address of a school that is non-existent. You are able to find their sister's records starting again after this transfer, but the boys never went back to school. There are no further records of them.
As homicide investigators, we believe strongly that no person should ever be killed in obscurity. We also know that no matter how long it takes, there's always someone or something, even a microscopic piece of DNA taken from a 7-year-old bone fragment that can lead to a break in the case. That's what happened here.
I was astonished. If it wasn't for DNA, I don't know if this would ever have been solved.
And we were able to confirm that Derek Dalton, born on February 27, 1940, and David Dalton, born on June 24, 1941, were in fact the babes in the woods.
The boys were 6 and 7 years old when they were killed.
When I think about how and when this happened, I believe it was daylight. I believe that these boys were fully unsuspecting. As horrible as it makes me feel, I believe that the sole purpose of these boys being walked into this part of Stanley Park was to murder them. The older boy, Derek, had 2 obvious hatchet clefts in his head, and David had 1. Our belief is that basically they were just struck.
Police believe the boys' grandparents had immigrated to Canada from Russia. Their mom, Eileen Bousquet, was born in Alberta.
The boys themselves, we believe, were born and raised here in Vancouver.
Eileen and her family would leave their homes in the middle of the night in order to avoid paying the next month's rent. According to her granddaughter, Eileen's granddaughter, they couldn't afford sometimes even to eat. The economy was in the crisis at that point. Post-war is never a good time for anybody, but I think it's always worse for people who are marginalized, who don't have money.
Eileen died 2 years before detectives realized in the late 90s that they should be looking for a family with 2 boys who vanished, not a boy and girl.
I can't help but think every time they ran the reenactment, every time someone mentioned the babes in the woods, that Eileen must have known, and that she never said anything about it. And I wasn't angry at her. All I could think of is her circumstances must have been so grave that she never even reported her 2 children missing, but raised very lovingly the 1 daughter that she kept.
It was never about seeing someone charged or arrested for these crimes. We always knew, especially through the passage of time, that that was extremely unlikely. But it was always about giving these boys a name and finally telling their story.
These children were born and raised in BC. Even if they came from an immigrant family, they were born and raised here. Why do you think nobody reported them missing?
That's the $64,000 question. I mean, there were other relatives that obviously knew of the existence of these 2 little boys. Why didn't they? I don't know. You would have to ask them. I certainly don't understand it myself.
And the mother has been the primary suspect all this time. Is that still your number 1 suspect?
I think we have to we make that assumption.
Why do you think it's the mom and not, say, an uncle or cousin?
Now, Mom would have been a suspect for sure, but so would have other family members. One of the things that obviously always points to Mom or to a woman was the fact that there was a shoe there, a female shoe, and the fact that these boys were covered. I would have to say that whoever covered them with that coat loved them, but that in no way says it was her. This one tip just really resonated to me where, you know, there's this woman with 2 boys, and then this gentleman sees them again, sees the woman again. This time she's not wearing her coat. She's sitting on a log with a man standing next to her, and she's distraught. Maybe it's the mother in me that wants to believe that that it wasn't her, and that what she did was stay silent in order to protect her daughter. Eileen's granddaughter, she looked at me and she said, "My grandmother didn't kill those boys." And she did mention that Eileen's father was a very difficult man and could be incredibly unkind.
It's my understanding the family doesn't really believe it was the mom. They suspect it might have been the grandfather, and that might explain why the mother didn't report her children missing.
The family's going to believe what it wants to believe. And I understand that. And my sympathy goes out to them. It does. But they want to believe that, that's fine. I don't.
Do you think the boys' fathers will be found?
It would be so nice to be able to kind of close the circle. But that takes more time and money. At this point, the file now is with the BC Coroner's Office, and I genuinely believe that the boys' fathers don't know they existed.
DNA analysis and genealogy, I firmly believe, is the future of investigations of this nature. It's a very powerful tool. If used properly, can solve many, many, many cases.
When you look at the crime scene photos of that time, they were obviously black and white. And I think over the years we've kind of tried to add a bit of color to them to see what it would have looked like. The trees, the leaves, and the bushes die over time. Every year a layer is added. So the kids were found under 5 layers, 5 seasons of dead leaves, dead twigs.
Although the trees of Stanley Park hid the children's skeletons for so many seasons, it was the family tree that ultimately revealed the boys' story.
When I heard their names and knew who they were, I was like, anyone who knew who they were was no longer here to mourn them. And I kind of felt like it was up to me at that point.
They were cheated. They were cheated out of life. They should be old men now with families, a work history and grandchildren, and it was taken away from them. They were absolutely cheated in life.
Standing here today, I think for me it feels, there's a sense of sadness that that 2 little boys, because I see their faces now, I don't just see the bones that I used to look at. The 2 boys that were happy and jovial were